The Gold Rush Bride. Chapter 1, A Gilded Cage. The scent of stale lavender and damp wool clung to the air in the drawing room, a suffocating perfume that mirrored Eleanor's own sense of confinement. Outside, the rain hammered against the grimy windows of their once grand townhouse, blurring the already dismal London street. Inside, the fire in the hearth struggled to cast a warm glow, its flickering light highlighting the threadbare patches on the velvet settee and the faded grandeur of the wallpaper. Eleanor sat stiffly, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a stark reminder of the dwindling time, and the dwindling fortune, of the Ashton family. Across from her, her mother, a woman whose once vibrant beauty had been eroded by worry and hardship, dabbed at her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. Another refusal, her mother sighed, her voice thin and brittle. "Lord Harrington, he found your lack of dowry inconvenient." Eleanor's lips tightened. She'd endured countless such rejections in the past months, each one a sharp, stinging blow to her pride. Her father's ill-advised investments had left them teetering on the brink of ruin, and her own lack of wealth had turned her from a desirable match to a burden. "It doesn't matter, Mother," she said, her voice strained but firm. "We will manage." But even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. Manage how? The question echoed in the oppressive silence. Their dwindling savings were nearly depleted, and the prospect of a respectable position for a young woman of her standing was bleak. She was educated, capable, but in this society, those qualities counted for little without a substantial dowry. A knock at the door startled them both. Mrs. Higgins, their long-suffering housekeeper, entered, her face etched with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "A letter for Miss Eleanor, ma'am." Eleanor accepted the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and angular. She tore open the envelope, her heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The letter was short, stark, and utterly unexpected. It was an advertisement, clipped from a newspaper, for a mail-order bride. Seeking a respectable woman of good character. Caleb Thorne, gold miner, Redemption Gulch, California Territory. Must be willing to travel. Send correspondence and photograph to. Eleanor's eyes widened. California? The Wild West? It was a world away, a place of rugged adventure and untamed wilderness, a place that seemed utterly foreign to her sheltered existence. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Eleanor! What is this? A preposterous notion." It's an opportunity," Eleanor said slowly, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at her mother, at the faded grandeur of their home, at the bleak future stretching before them. Perhaps it's our only opportunity." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "But Eleanor, you'd be going to the ends of the earth. To a gold miner. It's unthinkable." Eleanor looked down at the letter, her mind reeling. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into the unknown. But the alternative, a life of genteel poverty, of watching her family's decline, seemed even more unbearable. "I have to consider it, Mother," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I have to." She rose, the letter clutched in her hand, and walked to the window. The rain continued to fall, blurring the already dim streetlights. But in her mind's eye, she saw not the dreary London street, but the vast, untamed wilderness of California, a land of both danger and possibility. She would write to Caleb Thorne. She would send her photograph. She would take this chance, however reckless, however desperate. She would escape the gilded cage that had become her life. Chapter 2, The Journey West. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the steel tracks became the soundtrack to Eleanor's new life. The luxurious, if faded, comfort of her London home was now a distant memory, replaced by the cramped, swaying confines of a railway car. The air was thick with the mingled scents of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present dust that seemed to permeate everything. Eleanor sat rigidly, her small trunk tucked beneath her seat, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The verdant fields of England had given way to the vast, rolling plains of America, a landscape that stretched to the horizon, seemingly without end. The sheer scale of it was both exhilarating and intimidating. The train car was a microcosm of the rapidly expanding American West. Rough-looking men, their faces weathered and their hands calloused, swapped stories of gold strikes and frontier adventures. Women, some as refined as Eleanor, others bearing the marks of hard labor, shared whispered anxieties and cautious hopes. Among them were other mail-order brides, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. There was Martha, a plump, jovial woman from Ohio, who spoke excitedly of her intended, a store owner in a bustling mining town. And there was Clara, a quiet, pale girl from New York, who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. Eleanor found herself drawn to both women, despite their differing personalities. They shared a common bond, a shared leap of faith into the unknown. They exchanged stories, offered comfort, and shared what little provisions they had. The journey was arduous. The train lurched and swayed, the wooden seats were unforgiving, and the nights were cold. Food was scarce and often unpalatable. Eleanor's refined sensibilities were constantly assaulted by the lack of basic amenities and the rough manners of her fellow travelers. One evening, as the train rattled through a vast, star-studded darkness, a commotion erupted in the next car. Eleanor, ever curious, cautiously made her way to the source of the disturbance. A group of boisterous men were gathered around a card table, their voices raised in a heated argument. A tall, imposing figure stood at the edge of the crowd, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with a quiet authority that commanded attention. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine, an instinctive sense of danger. As she turned to leave, their eyes met. His were dark and intense, and she felt a strange, unsettling connection. He nodded curtly, and she quickly retreated to her seat, her heart pounding. The incident left her shaken. Who was he? What was his purpose on this journey? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to. Days blurred into nights, the landscape changing from endless plains to rugged mountains. The closer they got to California, the more palpable the tension became. The stories of lawlessness and danger, once distant rumors, now seemed increasingly real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train pulled into a bustling, chaotic town. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and wood smoke. The streets were a riot of activity, filled with miners, merchants, and a motley assortment of characters. Eleanor stepped off the train, her eyes wide with disbelief. Redemption Gulch was nothing like she had imagined. It was a rough-hewn, sprawling town, a far cry from the elegant streets of London. The noise was deafening, the sights overwhelming. A wave of apprehension washed over her. She was alone, in a strange and dangerous land, about to meet a man she had never met. The reality of her decision hit her with the force of a physical blow. But as she stood there, amidst the chaos, she saw a sign, a crudely painted board that read, Redemption Gulch Hotel. It was a starting point. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped into the bustling street, determined to find her way. Her new life, for better or worse, had begun. Chapter 3, The Rough-Hewn Groom. The Redemption Gulch Hotel, a ramshackle structure of rough-hewn timber and faded canvas, offered a temporary respite from the clamor of the town. Eleanor, clutching her small valise, approached the desk, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm Eleanor Ashton," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here to meet Caleb Thorne." The grizzled man behind the desk, his face edged with the lines of a hard life, raised a bushy eyebrow. "Thorne? He ain't been by today. Likely out at his claim." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her refined attire. "You the mail-order bride?" Eleanor nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Figured as much," the man grunted, reaching for a ledger. "He left word he'd be by to fetch you. Said he'd be late." He scribbled something on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter. "Room number 3. Go on up. He'll find you." Room number 3 was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, her mind racing. She had traveled thousands of miles to meet a man she knew only from a brief letter. What if he didn't like her? What if she didn't like him? The hours ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The sounds of the town drifted up from below, the raucous laughter of miners, the clatter of wagons, the distant strains of a saloon piano. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty street, a knock sounded at the door. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She stood up, smoothing her travel-worn dress, and took a deep breath. "Come in," she managed to say. The door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the room. He wore rough work clothes, stained with dirt and grime, and his face was weathered and tanned, marked by the harsh sun and wind. His eyes, however, were a startling blue, clear and direct. "Miss Ashton?" he asked, his voice deep and gruff. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her delicate features and refined attire. Eleanor felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over her. She was acutely aware of the contrast between her genteel upbringing and his rugged existence. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his voice blunt. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. "And you're rougher." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "I reckon we're both a far cry from what the other imagined." An awkward silence descended upon the room. Caleb shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've got a cabin out by my claim. It ain't much, but it's home." "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "We'll head out first thing in the morning," he continued. "It's too dark to travel now. I'll take the floor here." Eleanor blinked. "You'll sleep on the floor?" "It ain't the first time," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. He pulled a blanket from his saddlebags and spread it on the floor. Eleanor watched him, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He was not the romantic hero she had perhaps subconsciously imagined. He was a rough, hard-working man, a product of the harsh frontier. Yet, there was a quiet strength about him, an honesty that she found strangely compelling. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the man on the floor, she wondered what the future held. She had taken a leap of faith, a desperate gamble, and now she was faced with the reality of her decision. The wilderness, the gold mines, the rough-hewn man who was now her husband, her new life was nothing like she had ever imagined. And yet, amidst the uncertainty and apprehension, a flicker of hope began to glow. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a place in this wild, untamed land. Chapter 4, Life in the Camp. The first rays of dawn painted the rugged landscape in hues of gold and rose as Caleb and Eleanor set out from Redemption Gulch. The journey to his claim was a stark introduction to the harsh realities of frontier life. They traveled on horseback, the narrow trail winding through rocky canyons and dense forests. Eleanor, despite her initial apprehension, found a strange sense of exhilaration in the vast, untamed wilderness. Caleb's cabin, nestled in a small clearing beside a rushing stream, was a far cry from the grand houses of her past. It was a single-room structure, built of rough-hewn logs, with a dirt floor and a simple fireplace. The furniture was sparse: a rough-hewn table, a couple of stools, and a narrow cot. "It ain't much, but it's dry," Caleb said, his voice apologetic. Eleanor surveyed the cabin, her initial shock giving way to a sense of grim determination. She had left her old life behind, and this was her new reality. "It will do," she said, her voice firm. Life in the mining camp was a constant struggle. The days were filled with hard labor, hauling water, cooking over an open fire, and attempting to keep the cabin clean amidst the ever-present dust and grime. Eleanor, despite her lack of experience, threw herself into the tasks, determined to prove her worth. She learned to cook simple meals from the limited supplies they had, to mend clothes with rough stitches, and to fetch water from the stream, her hands growing calloused and her muscles aching. She even ventured to the nearby claim, watching as Caleb and the other miners worked tirelessly, panning for gold in the icy stream. The camp itself was a rough and tumble place, populated by a motley crew of miners, prospectors, and fortune seekers. The men were gruff and often crude, but they were also fiercely independent and loyal to their own. Eleanor, initially wary of their rough manners, gradually found herself accepted into their community. One evening, as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in Caleb's shirt, a woman named Bessie approached. Bessie, a weathered, middle-aged woman with a kind smile, was the camp's unofficial cook and healer. "You're doing a fine job of it, girl," Bessie said, nodding towards Eleanor's sewing. "Most city folk wouldn't last a week out here." "It's different," Eleanor admitted, her voice hesitant. "Different's not always bad," Bessie said, her eyes twinkling. "You've got grit, I can see that. That's what counts out here." Bessie proceeded to teach Eleanor the secrets of sourdough bread, the art of brewing strong coffee, and the remedies for common ailments. Eleanor, grateful for the companionship and the practical knowledge, found herself drawn to Bessie's warmth and wisdom. One day, while Caleb was working at the claim, Eleanor decided to try her hand at panning for gold. She took a pan and ventured down to the stream, following the instructions she had observed. The water was icy cold, and her hands quickly grew numb. But she persisted, sifting through the gravel and sand, her eyes scanning for the telltale glint of gold. After hours of painstaking work, she finally spotted a tiny nugget, no bigger than a grain of rice. Her heart leaped with excitement. She had found gold. She rushed back to the cabin, her face flushed with triumph, and showed Caleb her meager find. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You've got the touch," he said, a rare smile spreading across his face. "You're a natural." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. She had proven herself. She had adapted to this harsh, unforgiving land. She had found a place for herself in the wilderness. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the camp, Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands rough and calloused, her face tanned and freckled. She looked out at the rugged landscape, at the towering mountains and the rushing stream, and she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of home. She was no longer the refined young woman from London. She was Eleanor, the Gold Rush bride, and she was thriving. Chapter 5, Whispers of the Past. The rhythm of life in the mining camp settled into a predictable pattern. Days were filled with hard work, punctuated by moments of quiet companionship and the shared struggle against the elements. As Eleanor and Caleb adjusted to their new reality, they began to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the crackling fire, the silence broken only by the gentle murmur of the nearby stream. Eleanor, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the wooden table, looked up at Caleb. "Why did you choose to come out here?" she asked, her voice soft. "To the gold fields." Caleb's gaze drifted to the flames, his face etched with the lines of hard-won experience. "I had reasons to leave the East," he said, his voice low. "A bad business deal, some misunderstandings." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And I wanted a fresh start. A chance to build something on my own." Eleanor sensed a deeper story beneath his terse words, a story he wasn't ready to share. She didn't press him, knowing that trust was something earned, not demanded. "And you?" Caleb asked, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. My family, we were facing financial ruin. And I wanted a different life, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to escape. Escape what? Caleb asked, his voice gentle. The expectations, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. The constraints. The gilded cage. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. I wanted to be more than just a daughter, a wife, a possession. I wanted to build something of my own. Caleb nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. You're stronger than you think, Eleanor, he said. Stronger than most. A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence filled with unspoken understanding. They had both come to this wild, untamed land seeking something, a chance, a new beginning, a sense of purpose. Another night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Eleanor found herself drawn to the beauty of the vast, starlit sky. She stepped outside the cabin, her gaze fixed on the celestial tapestry. Caleb joined her, his presence a silent comfort. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, his voice low. It is, Eleanor agreed, her voice filled with awe. It's so different from the city skies. Out here, you can see forever, Caleb said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There's a sense of freedom. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a rare tenderness. You've brought a sense of something else, Eleanor, he said, his voice rough. A sense of home. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected to find such a connection, such a sense of belonging, in this rugged, unforgiving land. You've given me a home too, Caleb, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A home I never expected to find. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, rough, and strangely comforting. Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with a raw emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. Before he could say another word, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the stillness of the night, the crack of a gunshot. The peaceful moment shattered, replaced by a sense of immediate danger. Caleb's hand dropped from her cheek, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. The whispers of their past, and the promise of their future, were abruptly interrupted by the harsh reality of the present. Chapter 6, Danger in the Diggings. The gunshot echoed through the still night air, a sharp, jarring interruption to the quiet intimacy between Eleanor and Caleb. He instantly pushed her behind him, his body tense, his eyes scanning the darkness surrounding their cabin. Stay inside, he commanded, his voice low and urgent. And lock the door. Eleanor, her heart pounding against her ribs, obeyed without question. She rushed inside, fumbled with the wooden latch, and secured the door. Through the small window, she watched as Caleb moved silently into the shadows, his rifle raised. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The only sound was the rushing of the stream and the frantic beating of her own heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, another shot rang out, followed by a muffled curse. Eleanor's breath hitched. She pressed her face against the cold glass, straining to see through the darkness. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She saw Caleb, his silhouette outlined against the starlit sky, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark shape moving towards the cabin. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She recognized the figure, a burly man with a scarred face, one of the rougher miners from a nearby claim. He approached the cabin door, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the pistol tucked into his waistband. "Thorn!" he shouted, his voice rough and menacing. "You got something that belongs to me." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew that Caleb had been involved in a dispute over a gold claim, a dispute that had turned increasingly bitter in recent weeks. Before she could react, the man kicked the door, the flimsy latch splintering. He burst into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room, his pistol raised. Where is he? He growled, his gaze fixing on Eleanor. Eleanor, despite her fear, stood her ground. He's gone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He's gone to find help. The man sneered. Help ain't common, lady. You're alone. He advanced towards her, his eyes filled with a predatory gleam. Eleanor's mind raced. She had to protect herself, to protect Caleb. She remembered the heavy iron skillet she had used to cook dinner. She grabbed it from the hearth, her hands shaking, and held it up as a makeshift weapon. The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You think you can stop me with that? He lunged, his hand reaching for her. Eleanor swung the skillet, her fear giving her a surge of adrenaline. The skillet connected with the man's head, the impact sending a sharp jolt through her arms. The man staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. He cursed, his hand flying to his bleeding forehead. Before he could recover, Eleanor grabbed the rifle that leaned against the wall, her hands trembling. She pointed it at the man, her finger on the trigger. Get out, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Get out now. The man, his face contorted with rage and pain, hesitated. He looked at the rifle, at Eleanor's determined expression, and then at the open door. He cursed again, a string of vile oaths, and then turned and fled into the darkness. Eleanor stood there, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, the rifle still pointed at the empty doorway. She had defended herself. She had protected her home. A moment later, Caleb burst through the trees, his rifle raised. He stopped, his eyes widening as he took in the scene: the broken door, the bloodstains on the floor, Eleanor standing with the rifle in her hands. Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with concern. Are you all right? Eleanor lowered the rifle, her legs suddenly weak. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'm fine. He came after you. Caleb rushed to her side, his eyes scanning her for injuries. What happened? Eleanor told him everything, her voice still trembling. Caleb listened, his expression growing increasingly grim. You were brave, he said, his voice low. More brave than I ever expected. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. You saved my life, Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and pride. They had faced danger together, and they had survived. They had proven their strength, their resilience, their loyalty to each other. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the crucible of fear and courage. They were no longer just a mail-order bride and her rough-hewn groom. They were partners, allies, survivors. Chapter 7, Blossoming Affection. The aftermath of the attack brought a wave of fear and uncertainty to the camp. The miners, hardened though they were unsettled by the violence that had intruded upon their isolated world. But amidst the apprehension, a new sense of respect for Eleanor bloomed. Word of her courage spread quickly, and the rough-hewn men who had once viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and condescension now greeted her with nods of acknowledgement and even grudging admiration. For Eleanor and Caleb, the incident marked a turning point in their relationship. The shared danger, the vulnerability they had witnessed in each other, had stripped away the last vestiges of pretense and reserve. They had seen each other at their most raw and real, and in doing so, they had discovered a deeper connection. The nights were no longer filled with awkward silences and strained politeness. They talked, sometimes for hours, their conversations ranging from their past lives to their hopes for the future, from the mundane details of daily life to the profound questions of love and loss. Caleb, who had always been a man of few words, found himself opening up to Eleanor in a way he had never done with anyone before. He told her about his childhood on a small farm in the East, about his dreams of a better life, about the mistakes that had led him to the goldfields. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own stories of her sheltered upbringing, her yearning for adventure, her disillusionment with the constraints of her social class. She spoke of her fears and her hopes, her vulnerabilities and her strengths. As they shared their innermost thoughts and feelings, a sense of intimacy blossomed between them, a closeness that went beyond the physical. They discovered a shared sense of humor, a mutual respect for each other's strengths, and a growing appreciation for the unique qualities that had drawn them together in the first place. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm glow on their faces, Caleb reached out and took Eleanor's hand. His touch was gentle, his calloused fingers tracing the delicate lines of her palm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and husky, "I." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air, the unspoken emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper, encouraging him to continue. He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a raw intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I care for you, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She had longed to hear those words, had yearned for the connection that they confirmed. "I care for you too, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of newfound love, of shared hardship and triumph, of a bond forged in the crucible of the Wild West. As they pulled away, their eyes met, and a smile spread across Caleb's face, a smile that transformed his rugged features and lit up his eyes. Eleanor's heart swelled with happiness. She had found love in the most unexpected of places, with a man who was as different from her as night from day, and yet who had captured her heart completely. The future was still uncertain, the challenges of life in the goldfields remained. But now, they faced them together, united by a love that had blossomed amidst the dust and danger, a love that promised to endure. Chapter 8, A Threat from the Past. Life in the mining camp settled into a new rhythm, one marked by a quiet contentment that Eleanor had never known before. The days were still filled with hard work, but now they were infused with a shared purpose and a growing love. Caleb, emboldened by their newfound intimacy, proved to be a tender and surprisingly thoughtful partner. Eleanor, in turn, found a sense of belonging and purpose she had never experienced in her former life. But the tranquility of their existence was shattered one afternoon when a stranger rode into camp. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in fine city clothes that seemed out of place amidst the rough-hewn attire of the miners. He dismounted in front of the general store, his gaze sweeping over the camp with an air of disdain. Eleanor, who was helping Bessie tend to a sick miner, felt a shiver run down her spine as she watched him. There was something about the stranger that unsettled her, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake off. Caleb, who had been working at the claim, returned to the cabin that evening with a grim expression. "We have a visitor," he said, his voice tight. "Name's William Ashton. Claims to be your brother." Eleanor's blood ran cold. William. Her older brother, the epitome of everything she had sought to escape: the arrogance, the entitlement, the suffocating expectations of their social class. "What does he want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't say," Caleb replied. "But he's asking questions. About you, about our marriage, about the gold." Eleanor's heart sank. William's appearance could only mean trouble. He had always disapproved of her decision to become a mail-order bride, had seen it as a disgrace to the family name. And now, with the rumors of Caleb's promising claim spreading, William's motive seemed all too clear. The next morning, William appeared at their cabin door. He was impeccably dressed, his hair perfectly groomed, his demeanor a stark contrast to the rough-hewn surroundings. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "What a surprise to find you in this uncivilized place." Eleanor met his gaze, her own expression a mixture of defiance and apprehension. "William," she said, her voice cool. "What brings you here?" "Concern for my dear sister, of course," he replied, his lips curving into a sardonic smile. I couldn't allow you to remain in this predicament without offering my assistance. He glanced around the cabin, his nose wrinkling in distaste. This is no place for a woman of your breeding, Eleanor. You belong back in London, where you can be properly cared for. Eleanor bristled at his patronizing tone. I'm quite capable of caring for myself, William, she said, her voice firm. And I'm where I belong. Nonsense, William scoffed. This man, he gestured towards Caleb, who stood silently by the door, has clearly taken advantage of your vulnerable state. He's after your inheritance, nothing more. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his arm. You're wrong, William, she said, her voice steady. Caleb is my husband, and I love him. William's eyes widened in disbelief. Love. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. This is a charade, a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of respectability. But I won't allow it to continue. He turned to Caleb, his voice dripping with disdain. I'm offering you a sum of money, he said, a generous sum, to release my sister from this sham of a marriage. Caleb's jaw tightened. Get out, he said, his voice low and menacing. William's smile vanished. You dare refuse my offer? He snarled. Get out, Caleb repeated, his voice rising. Before I throw you out. William's eyes flickered with anger, but he sensed the danger in Caleb's stance. He straightened his coat, his face a mask of contempt. Very well, he said, his voice cold. But this isn't over. I won't allow my sister to be ruined by a gold-digging brute like you. He turned and strode out of the cabin, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Caleb pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and reassuring. Don't worry, Eleanor, he said, his voice low. I won't let him take you. But as they stood there, clinging to each other, a sense of dread settled over them. William's threat hung in the air, a dark cloud casting a shadow over their newfound happiness. They knew that this was just the beginning of a battle to protect their love, their home, their future. Chapter 9, Facing the Reckoning. William's threat hung over the camp like a storm cloud. His presence, a stark reminder of the life Eleanor had left behind, stirred up anxieties and uncertainties. The miners, though outwardly supportive, were wary of the well-dressed stranger and the potential trouble he represented. Caleb, ever vigilant, doubled his efforts to protect Eleanor. He rarely left her side, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that was now a constant companion. Eleanor, though touched by his protectiveness, felt a growing sense of frustration. She refused to be a passive victim in this conflict. William, true to his word, didn't give up easily. He made several attempts to persuade Eleanor to return to London, using a combination of emotional blackmail and veiled threats. He painted a bleak picture of her future in the Wild West, a future of hardship, danger, and social isolation. Eleanor, however, remained steadfast. She had found a home in the camp, a sense of belonging she had never known before. And she had found love with Caleb, a love that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and the challenges they faced. One evening, as tensions reached a boiling point, William made a desperate move. He approached Caleb at the claim, offering him a substantial sum of money to leave Eleanor. Caleb, his patience wearing thin, flatly refused. William, his face contorted with rage, pulled out a pistol. You leave me no choice, he snarled. A struggle ensued, the two men grappling for control of the weapon. A shot rang out, echoing through the camp. The miners, alerted by the commotion, rushed to the scene. Eleanor, her heart pounding in her chest, pushed her way through the crowd. She saw Caleb and William wrestling on the ground, the pistol lying nearby. Fear surged through her, but she couldn't stand back and watch. She rushed forward, grabbing the pistol and pointing it at William. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "Both of you!" The men froze, their eyes fixed on her. Eleanor, her hand shaking, held the pistol steady. "William," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "this has gone far enough. You have no right to interfere in my life. I've made my choice, and I'm staying with Caleb." She turned to Caleb, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "And you," she said, "you need to trust me. I can handle myself." Caleb, his face edged with concern, nodded slowly. He released William, who scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this, Eleanor," he spat. "Both of you." He turned and stalked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The miners, who had witnessed the confrontation, looked at Eleanor with a newfound respect. "Well done, Mrs. Thorne," one of them said, a grin spreading across his face. "You sure showed him." Eleanor, her adrenaline fading, leaned against Caleb, her legs suddenly weak. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude and admiration. "You saved me." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "We saved each other," she said. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship with the camp. The miners, who had initially been skeptical of their union, now embraced them as one of their own. Eleanor, no longer seen as an outsider, became an integral part of the community, her strength and resilience earning her their respect and affection. The threat from William, though not entirely extinguished, receded into the background. They knew he might return, might try to cause trouble again. But they were ready for him. They had faced their fears, overcome their challenges, and emerged stronger than ever. Chapter 10, A Golden Future. Life in Redemption Gulch settled into a comfortable routine. The initial chaos and uncertainty of the gold rush had given way to a sense of community and stability. The town, once a ramshackle collection of tents and shacks, had transformed into a bustling hub of activity, with sturdy buildings, shops, and even a schoolhouse. Eleanor and Caleb, their bond strengthened by shared adversity and blossoming love, thrived in this new environment. Their cabin, once a symbol of their makeshift existence, was expanded and improved, becoming a cozy haven filled with laughter and warmth. Eleanor, embracing her newfound freedom and independence, became a vital member of the community. She used her education and skills to help others, teaching the children, tending to the sick, and offering advice and support to the women of the camp. She discovered a passion for herbal remedies, learning from Bessie and the local Native American women, and became known for her healing touch. Caleb, with Eleanor's encouragement, expanded his mining operation. He invested his earnings wisely, acquiring new claims and equipment, and his hard work and determination paid off. He was no longer just a solitary prospector, but a respected member of the mining community, known for his fairness and integrity. Their love deepened with each passing day. The initial spark of attraction had grown into a mature and enduring bond, built on mutual respect, trust, and shared dreams. They found joy in the simple things: a shared meal by the fire, a quiet evening under the stars, the laughter of children playing near their cabin. One spring morning, as the wildflowers bloomed in profusion across the hillsides, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a wave of joy and excitement to the camp. The miners, who had come to view Eleanor and Caleb as their own family, celebrated with a boisterous party, complete with music, dancing, and a feast that lasted late into the night. The arrival of their first child, a healthy baby girl they named Hope, marked a new chapter in their lives. Eleanor, with Caleb's unwavering support, embraced motherhood with the same fierce determination and unwavering love that she had brought to every aspect of her new life. Years passed, and their family grew. 2 more children, a boy and a girl, joined their household, filling their lives with laughter and love. They built a life together, a life that was rich and fulfilling, a life that was a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their enduring love. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of glory over the mountains, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch of their home, their children playing at their feet. They looked out at the landscape, the land that had once seemed so alien and unforgiving, now a familiar and beloved home. "We built a good life here, didn't we?" Caleb said, his voice filled with contentment. Eleanor smiled, her hand reaching out to clasp his. "The best," she replied, her eyes shining with love. They had come to the Wild West seeking gold, but they had found something far more precious, a love that had endured through hardship and triumph, a family that had brought them joy and fulfillment, and a home in the most unexpected of places. They were no longer just a mail-order bride and a rough-hewn groom. They were pioneers, builders, and dreamers, who had forged a golden future in the heart of the Wild West.